Minerva is one of the most recognisable Roman goddesses with her shield and helmet, and she continues to gaze at us whenever we see depictions of Britannia. But she's also one of my favourite goddesses because she completely defies the contemporary tendency to consider all goddesses as either mother figures or love deities. Instead, Minerva is very much a goddess of intellect, forethought and craftsmanship. We see her as a supreme weaver, but she also becomes a tactical and strategic genius in military terms. Some consider her a goddess of peace as much as a war goddess, and she's also been described as the goddess of learning and writing, making her a figure very close to my own heart. She's also a virgin goddess who turned down both gods and mortals. But why was Minerva so popular? Well, let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We're wrapping up Roman Deities Month with Minerva, and it's quite interesting the way that these particular deities in this month have all ended up being deities that regular people worshipped as well as just the state, and they're gods that we can still see a connection with even now. So yes, we're going to finish with Minerva because I did have a look at Pomona and there just wasn't really enough to justify a whole episode. And like I mentioned last week, someone did ask for Epona, but I do have her in a Patreon bonus episode, so that's why we've kind of gone with Minerva. And Minerva's really cool, as we're going to find out basically. So we'll just get started straight away. So who was Minerva? Well, she ruled as part of the Capitoline Triad with Jupiter and Juno, and while she's often syncretised with Athena of Greek mythology, this evolution of Minerva actually happened slowly in the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE. Now, in actual fact, Minerva actually came from an Etruscan deity called Minerva. Now, this name came from an even older deity in the area, whose name Meneswo meant she who knows and she who measures. But eventually she was syncretised with Athena through the embrace of all things Hellenistic. And the most well-known origin story of Minerva sees her born from the forehead of her father Jupiter. Now her mother is Metis, a wise titan who Jupiter has already seduced. A prophecy said that Jupiter would be overthrown by his son, which is ironic since Jupiter did the exact same thing to his father Saturn. So Jupiter was worried about this prophecy and he decided to swallow the pregnant Metis whole, and eventually Minerva sprang from his forehead fully grown and dressed for battle. Some of the stories say that Metis actually crafted the armour for Minerva while inside Jupiter. But in my favourite version of the myth, blacksmith god Vulcan splits Jupiter's head open to set Minerva free. And Minerva did actually go on to become Jupiter's favourite child despite all of that. Now she's usually depicted wearing a chiton or a full-length gown, carrying a shield and wearing a helmet, and her sacred bird was an owl, a motif borrowed from Athena. But perhaps the most famous myth about Minerva involves Arachne. She was a talented weaver and she went round boasting that she was so good she'd even beat Minerva. Now Minerva obviously didn't appreciate that kind of comment and challenged Arachne to a weaving contest. Minerva predictably made a beautiful tapestry, and Arachne's was also beautiful and well made. Problem was, she made the mistake of depicting the gods seducing mortal women. Minerva took offence at Arachne's mocking of the gods and struck her. Now in some versions of the story, Arachne tries to hang herself in shame, but Minerva turns it into a spider to save her using the juice of Hecate's herb. And this particular myth goes on to explain why spiders are such good weavers. Minerva also appears in the Trojan Wars, having been spurned during the judgment of Paris. Now she'd offered Paris success in warfare, but Paris decided he would rather have Helen of Troy and declared Venus the fairest of them all, since Helen was what Venus was promising. As a result, Minerva decides to throw her lot in with the Greeks, and it was her that later gave Ulysses, or in the Greek version Odysseus, the idea for the Trojan horse, and this is where we can see this idea of divine inspiration coming from Minerva. Now, like Juno, she also hated Aeneas, one of the survivors of Troy, but she did actually change her mind about him over time, because he carried a statue of her when he escaped from Troy, and his dogged protection of the statue eventually won Minerva over. Now, another legend was adapted from the Greek legend of Perseus and Medusa, and I think I've covered this myth before, and you probably know it anyway, but just in case you haven't come across it or it's been a while and you want a refresher, in this particular myth, Medusa was actually one of Minerva's priestesses. Neptune decided he wanted Medusa and pursued her. Now, in some versions of the myth, Medusa fled to Minerva's temple for protection, which makes sense because obviously Minerva is one of the virgin goddesses and would obviously protect one of her priestesses. Now, Neptune forced himself on her anyway, and Minerva was furious to have her temple defiled in such a manner. Rather than punishing her uncle, she turned Medusa into a gorgon. Medusa's beautiful hair became snakes, and she turned any living creature that she looked at to stone. Now, in some versions of the myth, Perseus goes off on a quest to actually get to the head of Medusa, so you can kind of work out that he knows what he's going to need to do. But obviously, how exactly do you behead a creature that will turn you to stone when you look at it? It was Minerva that gave Perseus the idea of approaching Medusa by looking at the reflection in his shield. So this is where we get that idea that it's safe to look at Medusa in a mirror, but you can't look at Medusa herself. Because of this, Perseus was able to avoid her petrifying glare, and he beheaded Medusa, although to be honest with you, there are other versions of the myth in which he actually killed her while she slept, which is a lot less heroic, I think you'll agree. Perseus actually gave Medusa's severed head to Minerva after he used it to petrify the sea monster Cetus, and Minerva then added the image of Medusa to her aegis, which is like a breastplate. Now, if you are interested in depictions of Medusa in art and popular culture and you want to hear other versions of the myth as well, then I do actually have an illustrated talk about that very topic that you can actually buy for the princely sum of £5, and the link is in the show notes if you're interested in seeing that. Minerva also went on to tame Pegasus, the famous winged horse that sprang from Medusa's blood, and it's also Minerva that gives Bellerophon an enchanted bridle that lets him catch Pegasus when Bellerophon tries to defeat the Chimera, and obviously there is a podcast episode about the Chimera if you're interested in that one. So you can see from these, and this is just scratching the surface of the myths that Minerva turns up in, there are quite a lot of other ones as well, but these are the ones where we can really see how she gets involved because she gives people ideas and she inspires things in people. There are other ones where she turns Mars down because Mars decides he wants to marry her and she's just like, no way. And there are other ones as well. But these are the ones that I thought best kind of exemplified the idea of divine intellect, even though I think her behaviour towards Medusa is really quite shoddy. So who actually worshipped Minerva? Now, she was actually an incredibly popular goddess, worshipped by everyone from merchants and craftsmen to military leaders and statesmen. And obviously, as a goddess of inspiration, it seemed that artists also loved her. Now, because I'm a knitter and a crocheter, I kind of can't help thinking that she's probably the closest thing that we've got to a goddess of yarn crafts as well. The oldest known sanctuary to Minerva was found at Lavinium in Italy, which dated to the 6th to the 4th centuries BCE. But there were different temples to Minerva, and people went to different ones based on what they actually needed from her. So, for example, you might go to the temple of Minerva Medica on the Esquiline Hill, and there she offered healing. But if you went to the Aventine temple, people would worship her there and ask for inspiration. Now, it's probably under that last incarnation that musicians worshipped her, although Minerva does have her own links to music as well, because she's believed to have invented the flute. And as the story goes, she tried piercing holes into a tube of boxwood and then tried playing the resultant instrument. Now, apparently she did like how it sounded, but she didn't like how she looked while she was playing it. So she tossed it away and a satyr found it on a riverbank. Now, the satyr had no such qualms about playing it at all, and that's why we essentially have flutes now, according to the legend. So these are just some of the temples where people in Rome in particular would worship her. But when and how did other people worship her rather than just going to these temples? Well, her main festival fell in March, and it was actually 5 days long, called the Quincatria. It started on March 19th, and it's no surprise that it fell at that time of year, because if you remember the Mars episode, Roman armies actually left Rome for the campaign season in March, and you would also have various festivals to Mars as well at the same time. So this particular festival was intended to get Minerva on side ahead of any military efforts. Now, the Quincatria was actually originally a festival dedicated to Mars, but Thomas Apel notes that shifting it to Minerva eventually showed the maturation of the Roman Empire because they needed Minerva's patient strategy rather than Mars's raw power. Now, of course, people didn't just worship the gods, they also asked them for help, and various tablets have been found in which people address their god of choice, asking for their help in a specific matter. So where specifics aren't available, the tablets have to be a little bit more cunning. So, say for example, someone's stolen something and you want it back, but you don't know the identity of the thief. So you would simply say, whether man or woman, slave or free, so you're not actually specifying who it is, because if you specified a man and the thief was a woman, the god wouldn't be able to help. And there are a whole range of these curse tablets from the Temple of Sulis Minerva in Bath, but we're going to come back to that. So that was one thing that you could do. You could ask the goddess to intervene on your behalf, basically, if something wasn't going your way. Now, leaving votive offerings was also a popular way to get your prayers heard, and people left a whole range of offerings at her temples. At Lavinium, they actually left loom weights, probably in reference to Minerva's patronage over the crafts. People might also spontaneously mark their gratitude to Minerva in some tangible way, and someone actually carved a small shrine to Minerva at a quarry near the Chester fortress to show their thanks for the rock that they needed. So this becomes quite a small and probably impromptu way of worshipping her to say thank you very much for your help in this particular matter. And incidentally, Miranda Aldhouse Green actually notes that you didn't necessarily need to go to a dedicated shrine to Minerva, because you could sometimes go to other temples which also had space for Minerva. And it turns out that the London Mithraeum was one such space, and they've actually found statues there that revealed the temple welcomed Minerva devotees among others, which I think is quite cool. But I did mention Sulis Minerva, and it is worth having a look at her because she's quite a famous Romano-British figure, and she's essentially the deity that syncretised Minerva with Sulis, a Celtic water goddess. And Sulis was worshipped in the area we now know as Bath, where there was a thermal spring. So the Romans arrived, they liked the look of the area, and they decided to equate Sulis with Minerva to create Sulis Minerva, although Martin Hennig actually suggests that the Romano-British probably used the two names interchangeably. And in some places they call her Sulis, in other places they call her Sulis Minerva, and then in other places again they just call her Minerva. So they seem to just kind of see the two separate goddesses and the combined goddess kind of as the same figure. One of the things that is worth bearing in mind is the fact that Minerva's never really been associated with water, so the idea of a goddess of healing springs, the water part essentially has to come from Sulis. Now, Hennig also notes that the healing activities in Bath would have actually differed little from the healing activities at the Minerva Medica Cabardiacensis near Piacenza. And I think also if we think back to the temple of Minerva Medica in Rome as well, healing's clearly something that people did associate with Minerva, even if it's not immediately apparent from her incarnations as the embodiment of intelligence or military strategy. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind is I did obviously mention the lead curse tablets found at the Temple of Sulis Minerva, and what's striking about those is that it shows that she essentially presided over justice in Bath, but it was more a sense of retribution than the official justice offered by Jupiter. What is really interesting as well is how much of it is basically someone cursing someone else for stealing their clothes while they were bathing. So it's really interesting seeing what it is that people were actually asking for, or indeed cursing for, at the baths. Now, it is notable that with the coming of Christianity, goddesses like Juno or Ceres faded into the background. Venus was largely vilified and turned into a wanton figure of lust and damnation, which massively oversimplifies Venus. Fortuna actually managed to live on as Lady Luck, and Minerva was also preserved by Christianity, most likely due to her chastity. So by the 16th century and onwards, Minerva had become synonymous with fair, level-headed and rational female leadership. Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Anne and Catherine the Great were all represented as Minerva in some way. She did largely lose her deified status and instead came to embody concepts such as justice and intellect instead. She alone survived the purge of classical symbols during the French Revolution, and where other statues were torn down, Minerva remained in the Plaster Revolution to represent liberty. And she also even retained her links with the military, appearing on the United States Medals of Honor awarded for bravery in combat. And I think that this is probably why Minerva continues to be such a popular figure today. She can stand for a whole range of concepts that are acceptable to Western thought, and she's even been embraced by the feminist cause. I love her because she mixes intellect with the arts, and her patronage over the crafts also shows that we shouldn't really separate the crafts into something twee, while fine art gets high plaudits. Ultimately, Minerva looks after both of them, so I sort of feel like we should probably give them a little bit more credence, if that makes sense. But I also love her because Minerva completely defies the New Age notion of the gentle, meek mother goddess and the false equation of femininity with feeling and masculinity with thinking. Minerva being able to embody the ability to do both reminds us that we probably shouldn't get so hung up on these binary ways of thinking. So I hope that you've enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of Minerva. I'm certainly quite the fan, as you've probably realised. We are going to completely change gears next week, and I was trying to think, what shall we do for August? And I know quite a lot of people really enjoyed the city-based ghost story episodes that we did a few months ago. Actually, it was probably only a couple of months ago now, but never mind. So what I thought could be quite interesting is to actually have a look at folklore from the 4 capitals of the nations that make up the United Kingdom. So we'll be having a look at London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. Edinburgh is going to be really difficult because I've done so much of it as like Patreon only episodes anyway, so I'm going to have to find like a really cool story for Edinburgh, but I'll find something because it's Edinburgh, there's bound to be something. So I hope that you find that idea quite interesting. So we'll be looking much more at like your typical folklore, legends, that kind of thing, folk tales and so on, dark stories no doubt, that kind of thing, the kind of thing that you've probably come to associate with Fabulous Folklore anyway. So I hope that you do enjoy that kind of content in August. I haven't decided what I'm doing in September yet, so if you've got any requests, feel free to put them in the request form below and I'll have a look at those as well. I should also remind you that I do have the free talk with Cresswell Craggs coming up on the 7th of August, and that's on harvest folklore and superstitions. It's online at 6 p.m. British summer time. I just had to work out what time zone I was in there because I don't even know what day it is today. I've been off for 2 weeks and I've just lost all grasp of time. But yeah, so that's on the 7th of August. And again, the link is in the show notes and that's just basically so you'll get sent the Zoom link for getting a ticket. So it'll be lovely to see you there. I did also mention the Medusa illustrated talk earlier on. I am going to be re-recording various talks that I've done at the past and actually making them available as talks that you can purchase. They will have captions on them, so if you need subtitles and so on, then that's covered. And it just basically means that if you haven't been able to make it to a physical talk for accessibility reasons, or just the fact that you're not in Newcastle like I am, then hopefully you'll be able to catch up with some of the talks that way. And also it's just in case you've missed one in the past. If there's something that you really need access to and financially it's just beyond you, just send me an email and we can work something out. But otherwise, I hope that you have a marvellous Saturday. It is Saturday, isn't it? I think you know what it is. I've lost all grasp of time because basically I've got to try and send my PhD as finished as it can be to my supervisors on Monday for like one last look before I submit it. So my brain's completely fried. You have no idea how many outtakes there would have been from this episode. I've lost all ability to speak English apparently. But anyway, I'll let you go now. I'm just rambling now because, as I say, my brain's gone. And I'll see you next week when we're going to have a look at one of the folktales from London. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.